You are listening to the MSPoweruser Podcast. This is the podcast for the Microsoft enthusiast and power user. We discuss the latest news from MSPoweruser.com about Microsoft, Windows, and so much more. My name is Vernon E.L. Smith, and I'm joined as usual by Andy Bennett. Andy, what's up, man?
Well, this week it's Andy plus one.
Yeah, it's going to be a fantastic show. I am excited. I've had a great week so far, and this evening's already awesome. Today we are very excited to have our very first guest on the MSPoweruser Podcast. We'd like to welcome Jonathan Sampson onto the show today. Before I let him speak, many people will know him from his time spent at Microsoft on the Internet Explorer /Edge team. He was also an MVP and also a moderator and one of the, 0.05% of users on the top 0.05 users on Stack Overflow, which is impressive, and I don't even know what that means. He has recently progressed to even bigger and better things, and we will hear all about them today. Welcome to the show, Jonathan.
Thank you, gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here.
So real quick, tell me in like one sentence, what is Stack Overflow? I hear this. I know it's a cool geeky thing, and I'm just not part of the cool kids club.
It is a Q&A. It is an objective, peer-reviewed, community-driven Q&A site for programmers who have programming-related questions and want to help other programmers solve their programming-related questions and problems. So you go there, you ask a question like, "Hey, how do I achieve this effect in a cross-browser way?" And then you have a community basically give you their approaches, and then the community can vote on answers, move them up, move them down. It's basically a peer review process to help you achieve the best possible approach to this cross-browser drop shadow problem that you're facing. So it's pretty. I guess that's what it is in a nutshell.
Nice.
In another way to describe it, for me personally, it's definitely been the most helpful thing to look at whenever I have issues with CSS. So.
Yeah, it is pretty phenomenal. In the early days, they didn't even want web development stuff on there. There used to be another site called a DocType, I believe, and they would kind of push all the other web developers off to DocType. But the site just became so engorged with web developers that they figured, okay, well maybe we need to adapt a little bit and support this.
If you can't beat them, join them.
Right, and I think JavaScript is actually the number one tag on Stack Overflow now by a long shot.
Wow, that's crazy.
Cool. Well, I learned a little bit there. That's very interesting. Cool. Well, Jonathan, you've been working for Microsoft for a while, and obviously this is a Microsoft podcast. We talk about that all the time, and a lot of people that listen to this show want to work for Microsoft. What drew you to work with Microsoft? Why did you want to work there?
Yeah, so maybe we'll get into it in a little bit about kind of my roots and where I come from. But honestly, Microsoft is like quite literally just shy of a dream, this unachievable dream. It is this large company that has an impact around the world, and I'm just this guy that was born in southern rural Illinois working on watermelon and corn farms and stuff. And it's like that's such a long shot. But over constant, gradual, small steps, wound up over the span of just under 20 years, going from sweeping barbershop floors and detasseling corn to working as an engineer on the Internet Explorer and Microsoft Edge team. But that was the dream, is like to get to some place where you're doing something that has a real quantifiable impact on the entire world, and Microsoft was that for me.
Yeah, That's definitely something amazing to know that something that you worked on is used by millions of people.
Oh, hundreds of millions. That's what blows my mind.
Yeah,
it's like it's literally it is just one of the things I got in trouble for while I was there was leaking the counter for the Windows 10 incrementer. And it was so, we were trying to keep track of how many different people were upgrading to Windows 10. And we had this, counter that was really limited by physics. It could only count up so quickly because it was showing each, intermediate number. And so like we were pushing physics on this thing, like the limits of what we could show. And I was sitting there and I was watching this. I was like, oh my goodness, like this is rolling out to like millions and millions and millions of people right this second, like things that I've worked on. And I was just in that moment of just complete enthusiasm. I just, periscoped a short video of it, heard about it from my management the next week. And but I thought, oh my goodness, just for that moment, you're just caught up in so much excitement. Like this is going over the entire world. that I just, I made a questionable decision to share that. So,
wow, that is pretty cool. And I remember when that was leaked, I think it was Paul Thurrott and Mary Jo Foley that probably maybe gave it the most publicity, as we can, make sense. And that was really interesting. I'm like, wow, this is amazing. Like, they actually have a counter there, and I don't remember the specifics, but like, obviously you weren't supposed to share it, but wouldn't that have been a cool thing to share, like, purposefully? Maybe you're not in a position to make that call.
Yeah. It's that's way above my pay grade, I guess, as they say. Microsoft they have really phenomenal engineering teams, really phenomenal PR teams and stuff like that, and they have a rich history of experimenting with what type of information they can release, when they can release it, in what format they can release it, and I just kind of foolishly just circumnavigated that whole process and thought, oh, cool, like I have this phone in my pocket. I'll just record a quick video of this number going up because it's just making me so excited to see it. And so, they release that type of information by far more responsible means. And after the fact, I realized, okay, that was kind of a really boneheaded mistake. I mean, I've made a few different mistakes like that at Microsoft. One of the other ones was unintentionally leaking that we were building a new browser. I didn't mean to do that. Didn't even have the knowledge to leak it, but still managed to leak it somehow during a Reddit AMA. And so it was like, it's this learning process. You move from, like me, I always worked at smaller companies. You move into a company like Microsoft, and you're so excited about the idea that what you're doing has this global impact. But at the same time, you now have to be very conscious about the way in which you interact with people on the web, the liberty with which you share information about what it is you do on your day-to-day basis, and how that has to adapt and has to evolve to the changing environment. Now you're no longer working with a company that has a development team of one or two. Now you're working on a team of hundreds of people, and you have to take that into consideration. I mean, I went from small companies of like 30 employees to Microsoft, which I think has around 130,000 employees. And so you kind of have to adapt to that changing environment a little bit.
Yeah. Well, what was your first job with Microsoft what got your foot in the door?
So I was, before working at Microsoft, I was a practice lead and engineer for a company called Append2, which was born out of the jQuery library, the jQuery community. jQuery, for anyone who's not familiar, is just this open source JavaScript library, which kind of lets people do things in a cross-browser way without having a bunch of repetitive or slightly variant code. You can write things in one way, and jQuery handles the differences across Chrome, Firefox, Internet Explorer at the time. And so I was working with this company, Append2, and we had contracts with Microsoft, to try and prepare the web for IE 10, for instance, at the time. And Microsoft had this idea that they want to build a community. They want to get people in the community involved in the process of helping better the web. And so, we worked with them. I suggested that we call it the user agents. We went ahead and named it the user agents, which was really cool. And so I became a user agent, which was engineers in the community who don't work for Microsoft, but we're working alongside Microsoft in this joint vision to see the web be a better place. And so, that was involved answering questions on Stack Overflow, that type of stuff. And so from that, I worked very closely with the IE team. And the opportunity presented itself, after a couple of years of doing this, to actually go and interview with the IE team. And so I thought, well, my goodness, like I love the ecosystem of web development so much. How great would it be to actually work on a web browser itself and actually get to see the deep internals of how this stuff works? So flew out to Redmond, did my interviews, and then joined the IE team directly in Building 50 of Microsoft, the Redmond campus. And that was my first kind of position there. And that obviously evolved into the Edge team, and just kind of stuck with that throughout my entire time there.
Wow, that's pretty great. And kind of back up a little bit to some of the stuff about seeing your stuff used by all these people around the globe. How did it feel when Edge was first announced and there were all these obviously fake renders and mock-ups of it floating around with these people passing it off as real? Just how did it feel to see that?
It is just a radically different world. Again, we had our Reddit AMA, and this was maybe my second day or third day at Microsoft. We were going to do a Reddit AMA, and Microsoft had already done this before. The IE team had done this before, but it was largely PR representing IE at the time, and so the answers just weren't very technical. They weren't very good. And so, our management got us about 40 or 50 engineers into a room and said, okay, listen, everybody, Reddit is a very smart community. Don't play around with them. Be honest, be transparent. If you are, BSing anything, they will sniff it out. And so I thought, well, okay, be honest and be transparent. And, I had been in a Yammer, chat or group, whatever they're called. And I saw some people in another part of Microsoft, unrelated to the browser, just talking about the general reputation of Internet Explorer at the time. And they were saying, we've IE has gotten better over the years, but people still associate IE 11, the name IE, with IE 6 and 5, and these very antiquated versions of the browser. Maybe we should change the name or change the branding or do something to get people to reconsider IE anew. It's a totally new browser, but how do we get people to think about that? And so, someone asked on Reddit, they said, hey, have you guys ever thought about renaming the browser or maybe changing the branding or something? And I just answered, again, thinking be open, be honest, be transparent. It is not beyond reason that we might consider that. In fact, I recall seeing a very passionate discussion between two engineers talking about these scenarios. So I think I said something like, who knows what the future holds, winky face. And, the next day, I'm told, hey, you're on Forbes, you're on CNN, and all this stuff. And I'm like, well, what are you talking about? And, Forbes and CNN, all these large websites are saying things like Microsoft confirms new browser in development. Microsoft confirms, changing the name and stuff. And it's like, I did no such, what is going on? This is just a radically different plane.
Without the winky face, none of those headlines would have happened.
Oh, I know. And I use those emojis and those emoticons maybe far too gratuitously. And without that, the tone is radically different. And so, my management, they're like, so it's your second or third day here. How did you know about Project Spartan to begin with? And I'm like, what is that? I have no idea what you're talking about. I was just talking about a conversation I saw on Yammer. So, it was pretty wild to see, just the scope at which things blow up. And of course, you mentioned too, different types of false renderings and stuff pop up on the web. And Microsoft is so big. The Edge team is so big. And the design team is separate from the engineering team. And so it's, even whenever we would see stuff like that on the inside, I would have to stop and say, hey, pull someone over, Jacob Rossi or something like that. Hey, is this a real render? Are we doing this? And, it's because it's just such a big company and it's such a big team, big effort that you're not really quite sure what is valid, what is not. And so I've talked to, Mary Jo Foley in the past, and it's like, I listen to Windows Weekly because if I don't know what's happening at Microsoft. I'm so focused on my one little corner here that I need to have someone like Mary Jo Polthorot and many others to help me understand what is going on the bigger picture, because it's such a big effort.
That's incredible. It's just fun to hear your enthusiasm for that. And obviously none of that would have happened if you hadn't a base foundation of knowledge and experience. What got you into coding in the first place?
So, we were talking a bit before the show, and I mentioned that my whole life before the show was, in the summers, it was watermelon fields, it was detasseling corn. During school, actually in the summer too, it was wrestling practice, conditioning. During school, it was football. I was major sports junkie in my small town of 6,000 people up until about the age of 15 or 16, around that time, when my mother purchased our first computer, and I had never really used a computer before this. And we got this Star Wars game, Dark Forces 2, from LucasArts at the time. And I went online to the Microsoft Gaming Zone, which was really big in the late 90s. And people in the game, they were doing really weird things. They pull out their lightsaber, and the lightsaber would not be one of the stock lightsabers from the game. It would look different. And so I started wondering, how in the world are people doing this stuff? And They explain that with this game, it had a semi-open architecture. If you look at the CD, you can copy some of the files from the CD to the local file system, and these files are called COG files. And if you open them up inside Notepad, you can actually see where they reference different objects and events and stuff like that. And you can make small changes, save the COG file, fire up the game again, and you'll see those changes reflected in the game. And so one of the things that we did was playing the game. There was this 3D character called Max, a little rabbit character. And we opened up one of the COG files for one of the levels, one of the maps. And inside there was a reference to max.3do. And so we kind of recognized this pattern, a couple friends and I. And we opened up a COG file for like the repeater, which was gun number 6. And inside there was a reference to bullet.3do. And so we thought, well, what happens if we just swap those references and we just drop in max.3do in the place of bullet.3do and then recompile or start the game up and fire the gun? And so we did that, and we fired the gun and out pops a rabbit instead of a bullet. And we're like, oh my goodness, we are we're uber hackers, man. Like, do you realize what we just did? And it was the most majestic thing ever. And so, it was still way too complicated for me, but I could do simple things like swapping references to 3DOs. And I had a buddy of mine at the time who was learning HTML, and this was around the time that I got a computer, and I just got my Hotmail address. And I thought that HTML meant Hotmail. And so I would tell my friends at school, hey, I'm learning Hotmail. You guys should learn Hotmail too. It's really cool. And I remember telling him, like, hey, dude, can you teach me how to make a web page? And he was like, you just learn the code, man. And again, I had no context for understanding even what the word code meant. Like, code was like a combination lock on my locker at school. And so I was thinking, is this a combination code that I type in to the computer when it's on that weird black screen when it's turning on, and then out pops a web page or something? I was like, if I give you $20, can you write the code down for me? Because I'm thinking Konami code or something. What is this code you're speaking of? And so I quit sports my senior year, started just developing full time. There was Joe Burns, Dr. Joe Burns had a website, htmlgoodies.com. And it was just, I lived on that place, learning various different HTML elements and syntax and stuff. And then he even started teaching a bit of PHP at the time, which was still just light years ahead of where I was. But it was that, man. I just completely traded in sports and traded in everything and started focusing almost exclusively just on the internet and building out the web and learning the technologies that are used to craft it at the time.
Nice. It's kind of funny, that you mention how modifying Dark Forces too, because it's the more things change, the more they also stay the same in a way, because it's basically like taking apart an engine to learn how it ticks.
Yeah, absolutely.
Even if it goes to digital, there's still the same basic idea still working. Yep,
absolutely. The men in my family, they tinker with automobiles and stuff like that. My uncle was, at the time that I was learning HTML, he was rebuilding a Trans Am behind our house. And I remember going out there and just looking at this car with tubes and wires and stuff. And I'm like, dude, I have no idea how you make sense of any of this. And he's like, kid, I have no idea how you make sense of that box upstairs. And it was just this reflection of we are very much alike, just in two slightly different worlds. But yeah, it's definitely one of those kind of tinker and learn type of situations.
That's cool. I don't know what else to say about that. Now, growing up, in high school, I played some sports too. And when I can just imagine in a small school, you going from being pretty active to just, stopping cold turkey or whatever and shifting into this, arguably geeky realm. What was that like for your family, for your friends or whatever? And I guess for you.
Yeah, so for my friends and stuff, it wasn't that bad. I was a varsity wrestler and stuff, and I quit my senior year. It was actually about 2 or 3 weeks before the end of the season, I think, is when I quit. And my coach was understandably upset. We had to have our JV wrestler move up and be the varsity wrestler in my weight class. But it was just, I was so excited about, playing this game, making modifications, learning. And I remember, I think at the last practice when I started to kind of fade away a little bit, my coach was saying, some of you would rather be at home tinkering on your computer boxes instead of doing something, like making a quality investment in your life here.
Yeah.
And I was like, I don't know, dude. Like, I kind of feel like I could probably make a career out of this. And I had another teacher who I talk to him still today on Twitter. His name is Rick Johnston. He taught a class called Business Communications, and it was senior year. And he basically would pair students up with local businesses and have the students go out there and build websites for these companies. And the guy was just awesome. He'd let me come in and use the computers, long after school has been closed and stuff, just continued learning. Even, towards the middle of the year, when he realized that I knew more HTML than he did, he was like, hey, do you want to kind of spread your wings and start to teach a little bit? You can actually teach your peers HTML and stuff. And so I was like, dude, that's awesome, man. I'm totally down for that. Like, so, I got to start teaching HTML when I was in high school to the students in my class and stuff. And it was just a blast. Yeah, absolutely a blast.
And then what about on the family aspect of it? I mean, like I grew up in a rural, dairy farms and things like that. And even to this day, my mom especially just doesn't quite understand what I do. She doesn't really get why I went to Atlanta a couple weeks ago. Like she just, she doesn't, she's a very brilliant woman and very open to stuff, but it's just too big of a paradigm shift for her to really understand it.
Yeah, so I was raised in a single parent household with a disabled parent. And so my mother kind of lost the ability to work whenever I was in high school and stuff. And so we kind of had to balance our school and our work with also, helping to take care of mom sometimes. And, my mother, before she, lost the ability to work almost entirely, she took what little money she had and bought us the computer. I think at the time I told her I wanted to play this game, but I also wanted to do work for school and stuff like that. So she took about $400 or something, went across the Wabash River to Princeton, Indiana, to the Walmart there, purchased us a computer, brought it back, and that was kind of the first opportunity I had to start investing myself into this. And she was really always super supportive. Like I would spend multiple days contiguously on the computer. And, I was talking to her just a couple weeks ago, and she was like, you were just always on that thing, playing games nonstop. And it was tough because you couldn't go online without paying by the minute. And so, I was very fortunate that my first computer actually had an integrated modem, because if it didn't, I don't know that I would have ever even known what that was. Or let alone how to get one and use one and all that kind of stuff. And so my mother's always been just super supportive of me just kind of investing myself wholeheartedly into software, into programming, into web development and stuff like that. And so she's been a kind of a really a godsend in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Well, a couple decades ago, it wasn't too common for a high school kid to finish high school and get a job in web development or coding or anything like that. What was your transition into the working world like?
Yeah. So I graduated high school and I started going to the Wabash Valley Community College. There was a C++ class out there, programming course. I enrolled in that, and then after about 2 months, I dropped out and moved to Alabama, Gulf Shores. And really the only job I could get in Gulf Shores, because I didn't even really know that there was this programming world out there that you could be paid for doing what I was doing on the weekends, I don't think. And so I got a job doing construction, working and doing stucco work on hotels and on resorts and buildings and stuff like that. Wound up working with a bunch of Brazilian immigrants who didn't speak English very well, so I started learning Brazilian Portuguese. As a result, wound up moving in with 6 or so Brazilian immigrants in a 1-bedroom apartment. So that really kind of it was like a turbo boost on my Portuguese. And so that worked out really well. And then after, I don't know, maybe a few months of doing construction, I was like, man, I really wish I had I didn't have a computer. I remember sitting at the table, practicing typing just on the table so that I could keep my kind of muscle memory accurate and astute and stuff. And so I was like, I need to get back into doing computer stuff. And so I looked in a phone book, I think, under web design and under networking and stuff, and found a company called Gulf Coast Networking. And it was a small company, called them, said, hey, can I be a web developer there? Do you guys need that? And so, they brought me up, kind of interviewed me. I was doing some HTML, some CSS, not really any JavaScript or anything, but a lot of Photoshop as well. I was kind of really loved Photoshop. And so I got a job doing some really light design work there. And it was awesome because I was back in, my niche. Like I was doing computer stuff. I was interneting once again. And, moved from there, wound up getting a job at a small nonprofit in Florida that had like literally no projects, no deadlines. They just needed someone to maintain this classic ASP website. And I was like, oh, dude, I totally know ASP. And I didn't at the time, but I was like, I'll probably be okay. Like I can probably figure this out. And, wound up working there for about 4.5 years, making, I think, about $7.50 an hour the entire time I was there. And, it's like I just got that. I was in this low stress environment where I could finally, stay up all night, laying on my futon, reading the PHP documentation that I had printed out, or reading the W3C specification for the HTML language that I had printed out. And that's a big one. That's like 500 pages or something. And, I was like, I am in this perfect little place where I can just learn and soak up all this information. And then finally, after a few years in that environment, applied for a job through a friend of mine at a medical facility there in the Pensacola, Florida area, and became a .NET developer. And that was kind of where I started into the professional corporate track of going from this medical facility to working for a startup in Tennessee, to going back down to Florida for just a bit, and then back up to Tennessee for another startup, and from Tennessee to another startup, a Pen 2, and then from a Pen 2 to Microsoft. So it's been startups and small companies all along the way up until Microsoft, which was kind of the pinnacle so far of the story up to that point.
Nice. So all along this time, you also had a what do you call it? A personal life as well, or maybe you didn't, but at least as we discussed this earlier, you talked about meeting your wife and some of the personal stuff, I guess.
Yeah, so I was working for a startup in Tennessee, in Chattanooga area. Was very lonely, very bored, and so I'd go to the movies every single night by myself, and I was like, I need to meet someone. So I went online to this dating website, and I was thinking, I still have this Portuguese thing, and I don't want to lose that. It's kind of like, when I sit at the table practicing typing without a computer, I was like, I need to find ways to stay strong in this Portuguese skill that I'm trying to learn. And so on the dating website, the search criteria, I just typed in Portuguese. And it brought up two people who were both 2 hours away from me. But I messaged one of them, and we talked for about 2 days, and then we hadn't talked for about a month after that. And we finally met up again online, and 3 months later we were married. And
wow.
And so I was like, this is working out really, really great. And so met my wife online, searching for Portuguese. Happened to find just the most spectacular person in the world. And, that was, 10 years ago now. And we now live north of Redmond with our 2 kids and mother-in-law from Brazil. So, yeah, life is good.
That is awesome. That's such a cool
that's
story.
That's amazing.
Yeah, we lived 2 hours away from each other. And I was like, oh, this is just awesome. Like, finally I have someone who's raised from a radically different part of the world, has a different upbringing, speaks a totally different language and stuff. And, we just had dinner probably 5 times together. I would drive from Chattanooga down to Cumming, Georgia, where she was living. I remember one day she had this SD card that she couldn't get her computer to read. And I was like, oh, I totally have this USB SD reader. Like, you just plug it into your computer to read just about any SD card you have. I'll run it down after work. And so I drove down 2 hours, there, and dropped off this USB device, and then turned around and drove back 2 hours home to go to sleep. And I think she said around that time was when she realized that I was a keeper, because I was willing to drive 4 hours to drop off this SD card reader. And I was like, oh, no, it's not a problem at all. I'm just going to sit and listen to Leo Laporte for 4 hours tonight. So, this would be nice. And so it's been wonderful. It's been a nice ride.
That is so cool. So also your knowledge of Portuguese actually helped you at Microsoft. Explain that a little bit.
Yeah, so I went to Microsoft and there's a conference in Brazil called Brazil.js. It's put on by these two guys, Felipe Nascimento and Jaidson Gomez. And it is just hands down the coolest conference I've ever been at. These two gentlemen, they just do a phenomenal job putting on a JavaScript conference. And so Microsoft sponsored this and said, hey, we can, with the sponsorship, I think we can send a speaker. And so they said, yeah, go ahead and send somebody. And I went down there the first year. I was going to talk about mastering the developer tools inside Internet Explorer, because if you open up Internet Explorer and you press F12 on your keyboard, it'll open up developer tools that allow you to explore and manipulate web pages, the web page that you're currently looking at. And so I was going to go down to Brazil and talk about this. And so it was nice. I went down to Brazil. I did my initial interview. I started the interview before the speaking engagement in English, and I had told them that I'd spent the night learning Portuguese from one of the Brazilian Google engineers that was there, and that I was going to finish the presentation in Portuguese. And I said that part in Portuguese, and like it was amazing. Like everyone thought I actually learned Portuguese the night before, like I was some type of like Kim Peek Rain Man type of thing that just soaks up knowledge and doesn't drop it out. And so
that's awesome.
I wound up doing the presentation in English though, just because I'd never spoken before in a technical crowd on a technical talk. But the following year, I went back to Brazil.js to speak on ECMAScript 6 or JavaScript 2015, kind of the latest iteration of the JavaScript language. And that presentation, I did the entire thing in Portuguese, and it was just a blast, and I happened to be speaking just before Brendan Eich, the creator of JavaScript. And so I'd made a pretty decent impression by like handling the audience fairly well, showing some technical aptitude in multiple languages and stuff. And so got to meet the creator of JavaScript at the time. And it was kind of just a wonderful experience. Microsoft has been phenomenal. Just about everyone at Microsoft speaks at least two languages, which is really intimidating.
Wow.
So yeah, I can't say of the 130,000 people, most of the people I worked with spoke at least two languages, and it was really incredible. So,
of course, I think everyone there would speak two languages if you counted PHP.
Yeah. Well, so we during new employee orientation, one of the things they do is, because you have such a very diverse crowd at NEO, new employee orientation. You have engineers, you have construction workers, you have cooks. Anyone who is joining Microsoft that particular week comes together. And these are people from all over the world. And so one of the individuals who's organizing the NEO event says, we want to find out who speaks the most languages here. And, they actually included spoken languages and then written languages like PHP programming languages and stuff. And if I go that route, I speak, English, Portuguese, and some Spanish, and I'm slightly conversant in Russian. But if you add, programming, I've got HTML, CSS, C#, PHP, all this kind of stuff, JavaScript. But there was one gentleman in there who spoke, I think, 7 spoken languages fluently, and then like another 14 programming languages. And it was just like, oh my goodness, wow. Like I am in the presence of greatness here. Like this is kind of going back to that beginning question of like what drew me to Microsoft. It's like, you are now like on Mount Olympus, and these are like gods among men, and these people are incredible. They're like the best from all across the world, and I'm now sitting in a room with them. It's completely it's a magical moment. It's really wild.
Yeah, that had to be amazing.
That's so cool. I just keep saying that. I don't know what else to say. So a lot of times when we have a guest on the show, and we haven't had guests on this show before, but many of the guests I've had,
Vernon is still used to his other podcasts.
In general, when I have guests on, many of my listeners like to hear what people are using, both in devices and in services. And I'm that way. When I listen to podcasts, I like to hear what people are using. So we're going to shift gears a little bit. I just want to hear a bit about what you don't have to do your whole like phone lineage or anything like that. In the past we used to do that. I used to do that, but then it was getting pretty old and pretty long. So like what are your favorite devices like right now, and then even like of all time? Like what's your favorite, whatever your favorites in the Microsoft and I guess techie space?
Yeah, I guess my first favorite device was the NES back in '85. That was probably the coolest thing ever. Like that was my first, gaming console, first computer, anything. Today I keep it very simple. Today I have a Surface Book i7 that I use. I would have never purchased this thing just because it was so expensive. I think this one in particular was about $3,200. But my wife went out and got it, for me for Christmas last year. And this is, I say this as someone who, and I'm no longer at Microsoft, so I don't have to say this. But someone who was using a MacBook. At a Pin 2, I was using a MacBook Air. And that was a beautiful piece of hardware, a wonderful, wonderful device. But I can say without hesitation that my Surface Book is the most amazing device I've ever owned. It had a rough start there. There were some issues where you'd put it in your backpack and it would basically Samsung. What was that phone that was blowing up on people?
Note 7.
The Note 7. Yeah. There'd be some times you'd close your Surface Book and you'd put it in your backpack and it would start to just tick away and you're certain it's going to blow up on you because it would get so hot. But
Yet another time a company has copied Microsoft.
Yeah, and so this is, Microsoft has done just an amazing job at kind of developing the operating system and the firmware such that it can work more harmoniously with the hardware. And this is my baby. I love this thing so much. But outside of that, I was an avid Windows Phone user. We were going to go stay abroad for a short while, and we had just my son was about 2 years old at the time, and so we wanted to get some type of device to track his proximity from us, so that if he went beyond 50 feet, we would be notified about it. And unfortunately, the app ecosystem for my Windows Phone wasn't very rich at the time, and so we wound up having to switch over to iPhones in order to get this device that ultimately didn't work very well anyway. So I've not super into the mobile market as a connoisseur of hardware, but I definitely, I'm one of those people that are sitting back with their fingers crossed, hoping for a Surface Phone, because that would be my gateway back into the Windows market in this area. And, I say hoping because I don't know anything whatsoever. Like I remember reading about alleged Surface phones and stuff like that online and asking people at Microsoft, hey, are we going to do this? Like, should I go out and buy a phone, or are we going to surprise announce some hardware at the end of the year or something? And no one ever knew. No one ever told me. I don't know. So, and I'm kind of crossing my fingers because, the Microsoft has shown with the Surface Book that they can make amazing hardware, in my opinion. And I'm just so excited for whatever they might have in the future in that space, because I would love, love, love to get on board with a Surface Phone if one ever kind of pops into the market.
I guess you could say they're doing great things, just like the advertisement line.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we do expect something coming up. Well, we expect some Surface devices at the end of this year. Well, boy, the end of this month even would be nice. But a Surface Phone, or as I say, a Surface Mobile, we'll see next year sometime. Those are the rumors. Well, moving on, what you spent a great career at Microsoft, did a lot of awesome things. Pretty proud of what you've done there, obviously. What is what are you most proud of doing at Microsoft?
Microsoft is, I made so many wonderful friendships and stuff there. I think one of the most exciting things that I got to work on in recent time was a project with Greg Whitworth. And Greg is, I think he's just at Greg Whitworth on Twitter. But he's also part of the W3C, represents Microsoft on the kind of in the CSS space, the cascading style sheet space. But Greg had this great idea whenever I went to Microsoft. He was saying, we have this crawler inside Bing that just indexes the whole web, basically. Wouldn't it be great if we were able to find out, enumerate, and kind of quantify which CSS features are being used and with what values and stuff across the web? So, you go to a web page, they may have font weight bold to make some text slightly thicker than it would otherwise be. And so what Greg had the idea was that it would be great if we knew across the whole internet which CSS properties were being used and how were they being used. so that whenever a new property kind of pops into existence, like take Flexbox or something, which is a new CSS property that allows you to kind of more fluidly construct layout concepts on your page without having a bunch of extra HTML to accomplish that. And so what Greg was thinking was it'd be great is whenever these things pop up, we could be notified by Bing as it crawls the web that, hey, we now see websites using these new nascent CSS properties. And so Greg had this great vision to do this. And I was like, dude, I want to get on board. Like, this sounds like a lot of fun. Like, that would be an amazing, amazing tool to bring to the web, especially for web developers who are trying to figure out, should I start learning Flexbox? How broadly used is it across the web today? Or if it's not broadly used, which websites are using it? Because if only 2% of the web uses feature X, but among that 2% is Facebook, it's like, okay, you kind of need to weight that a little bit
differently. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I got to work with Greg on this, super brilliant guy, wonderful individual, great character. And we launched data.microsoftedge.com not too long ago. And so if you go to data.microsoftedge.com, you can actually see which properties in the CSS space are used, as well as on which websites, with which values, and over time to see, okay, is this property being used more and more across the web over time, or is it becoming less common across the web? And so as an example, we might see the CSS float property, which was used for layout, doing columns and stuff on web pages before we had Flexbox or something like that. If you go back into the 90s, we were doing layout with HTML tables, and that was really terrible. And then we started doing layout with divs that were floated, which means they just sit side by side as opposed to being stacked one on top of another. And then, here into the 2000s, around IE 10, we shipped this draft version of this draft implementation of Flexbox. And so you start to see, okay, are we going to see float left decline in usage as we see display flex increase in usage? And Greg's vision, Greg's idea was actually something that would help us objectively answer those questions. And so I got to work with Greg on that. And that's probably one of the most exciting things that I got to personally work on while at Microsoft on the Edge team.
I'm definitely going to have to check that out later. I'm someone who likes statistics, and that sounds really interesting.
Oh, it's so cool. It is so nice because you can jump in there. And what this does is one of the, so Google has, I think, status.google.com or something. And one thing they do is they lexically parse CSS and JavaScript files, I believe. But what they show you is what do CSS files mention. But that, what a CSS file mentions is not necessarily what a browser uses, because you could have some CSS that is inside of a file that is never applied to any element on the page. And so while it's inside the file, it's never actually used on the web. But what Greg's vision was to look at the actual use in the browser to see not what was declared inside some file somewhere, but when the page is put together and all the CSS is brought together and the final state of the page is presented, what was actually used. And that's something that Greg's project was able to answer. And so it was a phenomenal thing to be involved in.
Wow. Again, moving forward, I often think about what the future will be and how things are progressing, and try to predict the future, right? Everyone tries to do that. Most people fail. But I think about this app-centric world we live in right now, especially on mobile. And I just feel like that is nearing the end of its heyday. Personally, I think that my question to you is web replacing apps yet or ever?
I sure hope so. I personally, I just don't get it. I don't see why, and I'm not speaking on behalf of any company right now, or Microsoft or Brave or anything like that. Just as an individual, I don't get apps. I just don't get it. I understand if you're not connected to the web, how it's nice to have all that functionality kind of available on your machine. But the great thing about a web browser is that it is this distributed platform that I can write one code base. I can write the same HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, and I can run that across every phone, across every desktop, regardless of, if it's an ARM or something like that, or if it's a 64-bit operating system or a 32-bit, or if it is a 7-inch tablet, or if it's a 4-inch phone. None of that matters with the web. I can build one website and it works everywhere, and that's what's so magical about that. And so we start to see this shift where Apple, they were really getting excited about apps and stuff. And it's like, why would I want to invest my effort into building something for one platform? Like I don't get that. And so what was really exciting is that the applications themselves, although they were trying to start pulling people towards building native applications, they started supporting web technologies. And so this was kind of a nice compromise. And so Microsoft around Windows 8.1, they said, hey, we have these Windows Store applications. And if you write HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, where you can now build a native application on the computer itself, and you can deploy that to a desktop, and you can deploy it to a phone. And that was cool, because now I can build something that doesn't have to use a web browser. It looks and feels like a native application, but underneath the covers, it is just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, something that I'm very familiar with. But I look at the web today, and now we have this, there's this growing attention towards progressive web apps, which are, they are websites, but the moment you access them, they install a service worker, which basically allows them to function, with high fidelity offline or with limited connection or connection speeds. And we're going to start to see, hopefully, these websites that take up this hybrid mode, and websites that start to work offline just as well as they do online, and they can store a local cache of actions or data, and then as they connect to the internet, later on, they can transmit that information, update their state in the cloud. And so I'm really excited about that. And the progressive web apps, it seems to be something that is gaining popularity with just about every browser vendor out there. I don't know about Apple. Apple's a bit hard to kind of dissect a little bit sometimes. But I know that just about everybody else is pretty excited about progressive web apps, because it is not trying to displace the web. It is trying to fully embrace the web in so much that it actually makes it a kind of a first-party citizen on the desktop itself. And instead of trying to get people to go and build applications, we're just figuring out how can we make websites so smart and so advanced that they feel like applications. And I definitely am like firmly in the corner of progressive web apps.
Yeah, so just to ask a question real quick that's kind of related to apps and websites, you commonly did Weekend Warrior streams back when you were at Microsoft, where you would work on issues with Sites and Edge all day. What was the hardest issue to fix that you managed to, get fixed?
So the Weekend Warrior thing, that was just, I was just exploring. I've always really been drawn to media and stuff like that and teaching. The Weekend Warrior thing is just actually, which this is descriptive of the entire process of trying to make the web work inside a browser in general, is you're always dealing with other people's minified code. So you rarely see code as it was written by the engineers at these companies and stuff. And so, for instance, one of the websites I got to work on a long time ago was Nintendo.com. I don't have the original source for the Nintendo.com website. All I have is the code that is delivered to my browser from the Nintendo servers. And so that's already very difficult because the code is not formatted. All of the variable names are randomized and shortened and stuff. And so it's always super difficult to work in that space in general. But as far as what was, I'm blanking for a website that we actually were able to get fixed during the Weekend Warrior time frame, because that was about a couple months. But I do every now and then, we would always, anytime there was a reduction, which was trying to reproduce an issue with as few bytes as possible. But anytime I was able to get a successful reduction, I would file an issue on issues.microsoftedge.com, which is not something you could do easily in the past. That's another thing I'm very proud of and very excited about. And then also trying to outreach and get in contact with the company that runs that site, provide for them a working example of a solution to, make their site work across browsers. And even today, I've not been at Microsoft for a little while now, but I still get responses and tweets from people pinging those websites saying, hey, have you fixed this issue yet? One of them was basically they were using like a 7-year-old version of jQuery or something. And as a result, like some parts of the application just didn't work. And if you just update your jQuery, like everything magically started working. And so I can't think of anything specific that was resolved, although I do know there were many sites that were. It's just, it's starting to fade away as I'm not actively using that knowledge.
All right.
Well, what do you see the web experience growing into in not just like a few months or a couple of years, but like half a decade down the road? I don't really have the vision to understand that very well, but perhaps you do. What do you envision for that?
You know, I was talking to somebody else earlier today, and I was thinking, just looking back over 20 years or so of web development experience that I have, you know, back in the 90s, the only thing that we had these things called counters, basically, at the bottom of websites, where you go to a website and you'd see this counter at the bottom increment by 1 to indicate that you've been there. And you could sign their silly little guest book or something like that too. And then you fast forward, you start to see over time, like the web gets more and more mature, it gets more and more capable. Browsers become very, powerful. And around 94, 95 is when JavaScript popped into the browser. And then you start to have cookies popped into the browser and images and tracking pixels. And the web is becoming so phenomenal and so exciting. But at the same time, there are people who are using all of this power for ill intent. And they're doing things that are not so nice with it, and they're starting to track people around the web, and they're even starting to, there are people out there, bad actors, who get paid for every download of some type of malicious application onto your system. And so they'll use some really, sophisticated JavaScript approaches to fingerprint your machine. They'll figure out if you're a good target or not based upon what you have installed. And then they'll send you a download, drive-by download or something. And the user is none the wiser. The user has no idea the stuff is happening. And so one of the things that I really got excited about Brave, which is where I am today, is that, Brave is the first browser that I know of that has all of this stuff stitched into its DNA. And so when you go onto the web with Brave, you are automatically protected against third-party scripts, third-party ads, fingerprinting attempts, malware, and malicious scripting. It is all built into the core of what Brave is. And as a result, it's just a safer experience browsing the web. And Brave is available on just about every possible device and OS out there. And when you're not loading all of this third-party malicious coding that is trying to run some really intense fingerprinting algorithms, you actually have dramatically improved battery life and stuff like that. So, I look at where Brave is today as an example of what the future of the web could look like. Because not only does Brave basically lop off all of this malicious scripting on the web, as a result, you are actually lopping off the revenue for some of these websites, which is really terrible. And so Brave is going one step further than what many extensions have done, which is just cut off ads and entirely. And Brave is saying we need to, if we're going to do this responsibly, you have to find a way to put some money back into the pockets of the content producers. And so Brave recently launched Brave Payments, which is a way for me to load up my own Bitcoin wallet, which is built into my browser, with $5 or something like that. And then what it does is Brave looks at my monthly usage. It'll see, okay, where has Jonathan gone in the last month? If he spent 20% of his time on Hacker News, well, then we're going to send 20% or $1 of his Bitcoin to Hacker News at the end of the month, because that's what Jonathan appreciates. That's what he uses. And so Brave is looking at this, at the future of the web, saying the model we have right now is not working. The community is revolting in droves, installing ad blockers, AdBlock Plus, AdBlock, uBlock Origin, all this type of stuff. And it's starting to ultimately hurt the industry. And I mean, you gentlemen probably know as well that, ads are a crucial aspect to keeping any type of website afloat.
Oh, definitely.
And so it's like you can't just cut it all off like that. That feels good for the user, but for someone who's worked for a publisher in the past, you can't do that. These are people who are feeding their families and stuff. And so, in the future, I'm really looking forward to what Brave and, applications and processes that kind of follow in our wake, what they do, because I really think this is a model that has some long-term legs that can actually sustain the web moving forward and keep it, the type of quality that we've all grown up with, which is, something that just works for everybody, publishers and users alike. And I'm really excited about the model, what we've accomplished up to this date, and what we're going to be doing in the future with a 1.0 release coming in the near future.
Well, I
Oh yeah, I'm definitely excited to hear more about Brave. I installed it the day you announced that you were going to work for them, and I am really impressed with some of the ideas that have not only been implemented so far, but what you guys have planned for the future. And I'm excited to see it keep on coming.
Yeah, this is going from Edge to Brave. Edge was really exciting because Edge is kind of breaking up the monoculture of the web, which is largely Chrome. And Edge really, truly cares about building a web that works for everybody. And so if you go to html5accessibility.com, I think it is, you'll actually find that Edge is the only browser that has a 100% score on accessibility. And this was because whenever we were at Edge, this is something we just cared very intently about, is making sure the web works for everybody. And Brave is in a similar vein, where Brave is saying we want the web, not only to work for everybody, we want it to work for both of these parties on either side of this transaction that take place. And there's actually this weird guy, this third party, who kind of gets in on the action through iframes and stuff, and we want to cut that guy off because he's hurting everybody. And he's not supposed to be part of the equation to begin with. And so, the two different teams are so similar in their fabric and DNA that it was a nice, smooth transition. And I love what the Edge team is doing. Very excited for them. Going to continue watching as a fan moving forward as we both kind of plow in separate but parallel fields.
Well, I really love how you have integrated this voluntary contribution mechanism into the browser. That is just very, very interesting. Basically, just divvying up where like your tithe, like just where you want to share your money. I think that's awesome, and it's so forward thinking. I think it's quote unquote correct morally. I like that mentality of it. As with anything, it can be abused. What do you think about? You weren't expecting this question. What do you think about I don't know how to say this, like the morality of the web, and like how you balance things back into the side of right? I don't know if there's really a way to. I don't know. I just felt that you were leaning that direction, and I don't know what. I just felt compelled to ask the question, I guess.
Yeah, this kind of goes back to why even do Brave payments at all? Like, why not just kind of go with the current trend and just cut off ads entirely, or do what other people are doing? Cut off everyone's ads and then say, hey, if you pay us a premium, we'll let your ads through. And it's like, well, that sounds kind of slimy too. Like that's really messed up.
Yeah.
And so Brave has this. Yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say that, about the mention of, say, AdBlock's acceptable ads program. That is, by all means, incredibly scummy, and I am amazed that people are still supporting that idea.
I am by no means in favor of that.
Yeah, so what we kind of looked at this is like, okay, this has to be something that we can go home and tell grandma about, and she'll be smiling and happy for us and stuff. Like, it can't be the type of thing that is going to get you shunned at the turkey table come Thanksgiving. And so it's like, okay, if you're going to turn off ads, you have to have a good, solid, and sober process for doing so. And so one thing Brave doesn't do is Brave doesn't touch first party ads. So if you go to Microsoft.com and there is an ad that is loaded from Microsoft.com, meaning Microsoft controls the content of that ad, then that ad is left untouched. Brave will not mess with that. But if you go to Microsoft.com and an ad is loaded from awesomefreesoftware.com.blogspot.net or something weird like this, with 140 different path separators after that, then we start to say, okay, that looks weird. And this is usually a recipe for disaster. So let's cut this off. And then, if the user wants to permit that, they can even do that on a per domain basis and say, hey, for anything that Microsoft wants to load, regardless if it's from a third party, let it through. So we're given a kind of a good, solid way of doing that. But we're also saying, listen, we know that this is going to have there could be some casualties of war here. You start to cut off third party scripting. Not all of that is dangerous, but it's really hard to tell which ones are just in real time and protect the users from them. So, Brave Payments is the way to kind of balance that, to bring balance to the universe again. And so with that, it's like, I can load up my wallet with $5 or even less than that if I wanted to. And actually, I can put more money into the pocket of the content producer than they would have gotten through some other ad system. Just by directly giving them $1 at the end of the month or something. That's more than they would have made off me otherwise. And so with the Brave ads that'll be coming in the future as well, Brave ads is a way to put, I think, up to like 70 to 75% of the revenue back into the pocket of the content producer, the site owner, which is 10%, sometimes more than what you're going to see in any other kind of ad network out there. And so that's one of the things that really kind of compelled me to join Brave, is that these people, they aren't just thinking from the user side perspective of things, that I want my site to be uninterrupted. I want my browsing experience to be uninterrupted. They're thinking about the full spectrum of things, because that's what's necessary to make sure that you have an approach that is going to have legs, that is going to work long term. We're not just trying to build something that's going to be here for a couple of years and then fade away. We're trying to figure out a true solution to this problem that we're facing. And that's one of the things I really admire about, Brendan Ike and the other people working at Brave right now.
Fantastic. What else can you tell us about Brave as far as like how old it's been, I suppose, and what is coming soon with Brave? Yeah,
so Brave is still a relatively new product, really, really new. One of the great things I love about it, though, is if you have Brave opened up right now, if any of your listeners are hearing this and they have Brave opened up and they press Shift F8. So I mentioned earlier about teaching about web development tools in Brazil with Internet Explorer, pressing F12. Well, if they press Shift F8, it's going to open up developer tools on the Brave browser. And the tools are not to inspect the web page that you're looking at. The tools are to inspect the actual browser itself, because Brave is written with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And this just completely blew my mind. I was like, oh my goodness, this is kind of like what Microsoft started doing with the Windows Store applications back in 2012 or so, where they're saying you can build native applications with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. And some of your scripts, you can even have elevated reach into some of the more low-level APIs of the operating system. And so Brave is built with Chromium, which is the engine behind Chrome, and Node.js, which is basically a packaged application that has the V8 engine from Chrome as well. And so Brave is a web app that looks like a desktop application that loads websites inside of it via a web view. And it was phenomenal, because it's like I can take 20 years of experience of building websites and now apply that directly to working on an application that works on iOS, on desktop, on Mac OS. It's all across the board. It's so phenomenal. And so what we're doing right now,
it's open source too, isn't it?
Yeah. So that's the thing that blows my mind. Microsoft, one of the things that many people inside Microsoft want to do is be more open. And it's really difficult to turn a ship that big. And so what we did was get really creative and find ways that you can have more isolated pockets of efforts that are open source. And so, a lot of what Greg Whitworth, I talked about him earlier, a lot of what people on the Edge team are doing, they do on GitHub. And so they find little ways that they can be open. The difference with Brave, though, is that Brave is entirely open. It's built on Chromium, which is completely open. It's built on, Electron.js, which is completely open. We use Squirrel to install on Windows and stuff. That's completely open. And in many cases, these are all on GitHub, which is you're using one type of interface to look at the source code for all these different applications. Chromium has a slightly more intimidating interface, but Electron, Squirrel, Brave itself, all of the source code is on GitHub. And so anybody can go there, they can see exactly what the application is doing, they can file bugs, they can reference lines of code, they can look at specific commits. You could sit, if you wanted to, and look at the commit log for the Brave application itself and see, okay, the Brave team has committed 40 times today, and this is exactly what they did. And so this is what we can expect to see in future releases. And so, we continue to build up to a 1.0 release, and we continue to do so in the open, which is pretty amazing that I don't have to worry about leaking something anymore. My first week at Brave, I was talking to people on Twitter, and I would message Brian Bondi or Brendan Ike, the two kind of co-founders of Brave, and I would send them out a a sample tweet of what I might answer and say, hey, can you guys review this? Make sure that it is appropriate, that we're not overstepping our commitments in this area. And, just let me know when I can send this out on Twitter. And Brian Bondi would be like, what are you doing? Like, just answer the tweet. It's okay. And I was like, oh my goodness, it's a different world when everything is completely open source. And so you just don't have to worry about things as much. And so it is a truly phenomenal team, a phenomenal product, and I'm so excited about our future.
Nice.
Yeah, I definitely am too. I think we're kind of near the end time for the podcast, which makes me sad, admittedly, because I would love to go on talking for another hour.
Well, maybe we'll do like a part B sometime.
Yeah, I would totally be up for that.
Well, I do want to get a couple last quick questions or answers from you on this. I want to hear what you feel are some of the biggest web mistakes, for lack of a better term, that you see people making, both just consumers using a browser, but also people developing for a browser. What kind of mistakes are people making?
Yeah, looking at like consumers, that's probably a little tougher for me because I'm so deeply ingrained into the developer mindset. But consumers, I guess if you look back to you remember like the old Internet Explorer toolbars that everyone would install, and you'd wind up having like 400 vertical pixels of the Yahoo toolbar and the Ask Jeeves toolbar and all this crazy stuff inside, because consumers just if something looks cool, they just add it, or they will download something else that will act as a Trojan horse for that application. And so you see that today. I think if you download maybe Adobe Acrobat or something, and you have to double check this, but I think what happens is as you're installing it, they will actually toss Google Chrome onto your operating system as well if you don't have it.
That's right.
And so this stuff happens so consistently across the average user session on the computer. And so it's one of those things where it's like, just always be very skeptical about what it is you're doing. We learned in recent years that, don't run as administrator on your machine. Have an administrator account, but create a user account with lesser privileges so that in the event that something does happen, you're still safe, because no application has the ability to write or doing like that to different parts of your OS. And Steve Gibson, from Security Now, has talked about just that approach in the past, and how Windows XP users who were not running as administrator would have next to no vulnerabilities whatsoever, or next to no compromises on their machine, just by virtue of running as a lesser privileged user on the machine. And so there are things like that you could definitely do. And in the browser space, don't install every extension you come across. It's kind of crazy. But in the developer space, there are totally things that I think myself and others like me can focus on more. If you are not familiar with, I think it was LeftPadGate on the web, there's this service called NPM, which is a Node package manager. So we talked about Node a little bit, being the JavaScript portion of Electron. And so Node lets you run JavaScript on the client, so on the desktop basically. And there's this whole kind of phone book type of thing out there, this giant catalog called NPM, and you can install little modules from there that you can use in your applications. And there was a module on there called LeftPad. And what it was is if you had a string, like with the number 1, and you wanted to make sure that the 1 was always left padded with 4 zeros, so you always had 5 digits in your string. And if you had the number 22, then you'd have 3 zeros to the left. If you had the number 127, you'd have 2 zeros to the left. So there was this functionality called LeftPad, which is a very trivial thing to do. But a lot of people, tons and tons of websites and applications, they had a hard dependency on LeftPad, which was a very trivial thing to write, but no one would write it themselves. They would just loop in this dependency from NPM. And then one day, the creator or the maintainer of LeftPad changed its name, which disconnects everyone that is reliant upon that functionality, or something to that effect. They changed the name, or they just deleted the project whatsoever, something like that. And as a result, literally probably tens of thousands or more applications started throwing exceptions because they didn't have left pad functionality inside them. They couldn't make their number one with one digit be the number one preceded by 4 zeros, totaling 5 digits. And this was, I think, stepping back and looking at this, the community of developers were just so kind of saddened by this, that rather than just writing this trivial functionality into our applications, we would much rather take on this hard dependency for a module out in the cloud that is not really ever going to change. I mean, you check the length of a string, and if the length is less than 5, then you throw a few different zeros in front of it. It's a very simple thing. And so, developers, I think we really got to buck down and do things, with intent, do things with sincerity, and really be kind of focused on writing reliable, solid, hardened code. Because that ultimately, if we kind of put ourselves in a predicament where we could be crippled by a single broken dependency like this, especially for something so trivial, we kind of put the future in a questionable state where things they're going to be unreliable, and that's not good for anybody. We got to kind of make sure that the quality of the stuff moving forward is pretty excellent. So
that's a great place to end. I think
yeah.
I'm so glad.
This has just been amazing. Really, it's something that has definitely opened my eyes, certainly, to a lot of stuff, and just simply put, wow.
It has been a blast talking with you, gentlemen. So I would definitely be on board, coming back and doing a part B sometime.
For sure. Yep. Yeah. We'll make it happen. It sounds good.
Oh, definitely. I guess it's time for an outro, though, so it's Vernon's turn for that.
Yeah, well, as we finish out here, listeners, thank you for checking out another episode of MSPoweruser Podcast. You can follow the site on Twitter at MSPoweruser, and, of course, you can subscribe to the podcast so we are in your feed every week right away. If you feel compelled to interact with us individually, Twitter is our favorite medium. I'm on Twitter at VernonEL. Andy's on Twitter at FusionFan45. Jonathan, why don't you share with the listeners where people can best interact with you?
Yeah, I'm actually all over Twitter. I have about a dozen accounts, but the two best ones to reach me at would be at Jonathan Sampson. That's just kind of my personal interactions. But if you want to know more about Brave or talk to me, have some questions or comments, suggestions, definitely reach out to at Brave Sampson, and I'll be there as well.
Very good. Well, we are going to end it here. Thanks again, Jonathan, for joining us. It's been awesome. Listeners, have a great week. Take care.